Leading a startup team, whether you're delivering a sugar rush, stocking coffee, or getting a regular delivery of snacks, Office Depot has solutions that fit every startup culture, from getting those first business cards and stationery to ordering fleece pullovers with your new logo. To learn how Office Depot and the California Technology Council have partnered to bring you savings on all of these startup essentials and more, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. In August, Nabriva Therapeutics won U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval for Xenleta for the treatment of community-acquired bacterial pneumonia in adults. It was the first new antibiotic with a novel mechanism of action approved by the FDA in nearly 2 decades for the condition. We spoke to Ted Schroeder, CEO of Nabriva, about Xenleta's unique mechanism of action, why it may be less prone to the development of resistance, and why policymakers still need to take additional steps to spur development of novel antibiotics. Ted, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always exciting to have a chance to talk about Nabriva.
Well, we're going to talk about Nabriva, the need for new antibiotics, and your transformation into a commercial stage company with the approval of Xenleta to treat community-acquired bacterial pneumonia. Let's start with the state of antibiotic development today, though. For many years, we've heard about the concern over the growing threat of resistant bacteria and a lack of antibiotics in development. Is this still the case? How big a concern is the need to expand the antibiotic arsenal?
Well, it's a growing concern for sure. It's been a concern for a number of years and doesn't seem to be abating. In fact, just recently, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, released its updated antibiotic resistance threats in the United States, indicating that antibiotic-resistant bacteria and fungi cause more than 2.8 million infections and 35,000 deaths in the United States each year. The problem will get worse if we don't act on it. In fact, there are many pathogens that require attention right now that are resistant to most, if not all, antibiotics. And that includes those that can cause community-acquired bacterial pneumonia and complicated urinary tract infections. And that's happens to be the primary work at Nabriva. We're convinced we can make a difference.
What exactly is community-acquired bacterial pneumonia, and how is it treated today?
Yeah, community-acquired bacterial pneumonia is the most common type of pneumonia, and it does have serious health consequences. It affects more than 5 million Americans each year and is the leading cause of infection-related death. The most common cause of community-acquired pneumonia in the United States is a bacteria called Streptococcus pneumoniae. This type of pneumonia can follow viral infections such as the flu and can cause shortness of breath, fever, and cough. In community-acquired bacterial pneumonia, infection occurs outside the hospital or other healthcare facilities, and it's particularly acute in the older population. Older patients, especially those with other complicating conditions, are at the highest risk for increased mortality and morbidity.
In August, your company won regulatory approval for Xenleta, which is the first of a new class of antibiotics. What is Xenleta, and how does it work?
So Xenleta is the first-class systemic fluoromutilin antibiotic indicated for the treatment of adult patients with community-acquired pneumonia. And it was approved in both the IV and oral formulations. It works by targeting the ribosome, so the so-called protein factory of the cell, and inhibits the production of new proteins. Now, other antibiotics do this, but lefamulin does it in a new and unique way. It doesn't share any binding sites on the ribosome with other antibiotics that are commercially available. And so it blocks what is known as the peptidyltransferase domain on the ribosome. So therefore, it kills in a fundamentally different way. And that means there's a lower risk of developing resistance. And to date, we have seen very rare instances of cross-resistance with other antibiotics.
And is that a fairly unique mechanism compared to what we see in other antibiotics?
It is. It's unique because it's a unique binding site that's not shared with any other antibiotic, and that's what really separates it from many of the antibiotics that have been brought to market over the last couple of decades.
And is this a naturally occurring antibiotic?
Well, it certainly originally was naturally occurring. It was derived from a edible mushroom and synthesized in labs, and now it's a fully synthesized antibiotic, but it had a natural derivation.
There's a big concern about the growing resistance to antibiotics. Is there a case to make why this antibiotic may be less prone to seeing resistance develop against it?
Well, one of the things that bacteria are pretty good at is figuring out what's trying to kill them. And so over time, they've developed mechanisms to evade antibiotics, and there are many different ways bacteria have evolved to evade that. The importance of a new class that kills in a fundamentally different way is that bacteria haven't been exposed to that antibiotic in the past. They haven't developed mechanisms. If you have the same class of antibiotic but just a different molecule, or you add an inhibitor to it, it still kills the antibiotic in the same way as its predecessors. In the case of Xenleta, it has a unique binding site on the ribosome that's not shared with any other antibiotic. So it's novel to the bacteria. They haven't seen it before, and importantly, it doesn't exhibit cross-resistance to other antibiotics that are commonly used.
What's known about Xenleta from the clinical studies that were performed?
So we did 2 so-called pivotal trials for FDA approval. They were called LEAP 1 and LEAP 2. LEAP 1 was a IV to oral, or at least the physicians had the opportunity to switch to oral course of therapy, and LEAP 2 was an oral-only short course 5-day therapy. We compared that in the standard FDA protocol to an existing antibiotic, moxifloxacin, which is antibiotics the quinolone class, which is a highly effective antibiotic and thought to be a rather potent antibiotic in community-acquired pneumonia. And our trials showed that we were comparable to this antibiotic, but with a different mechanism of action and a somewhat different safety profile, because Xenleta covers no boxed warnings from the FDA.
Are you looking at other indications for Xenleta?
Well, certainly there have been other indications under consideration. I should say that the Xenleta was developed specifically for respiratory infections because it has a spectrum of activity that fits with respiratory pathogens, covering both gram-positive and so-called atypical bacteria, without a lot of off-target effects in other bacteria that may reside in the gut, like E. coli, for example. Unlike other classes like the quinolones, who are effective in respiratory infections but have a lot of off-target activity for other bacteria, and that only increases the resistance pressure on those bacteria. There are opportunities and other indications like skin and soft tissue infections, and in fact we completed a early stage trial in skin and soft tissue infections, and there has been interest in resistant sexually transmitted diseases as well. And at the moment we're focused on the commercialization of Xenleta in community-acquired pneumonia, but there's certainly the opportunity to expand the indications as we think about the other applications.
And are you commercializing this on your own, or are you seeking a partner to do this?
In the United States, we've launched with our own 60-person sales force. They're largely focused on hospitals. There are 900 hospitals that they're focusing on. But in addition, they also call on about 6,000 primary care physicians that are geographically adjacent to the medical centers where they primarily are promoting the product.
You have a second antibiotic in development, Contepo, for complicated urinary tract infections. You were seeking approval for this, but had a setback when the FDA declined to approve it because of manufacturing issues. Where are you in efforts to win approval for that?
So we've been working closely with our contract manufacturers to resolve the concerns that the FDA raised. We recently announced publicly that we intend to resubmit IV fosfomycin or Contepo by the end of this year, so in the next couple of weeks. And then the FDA has told us that it would be a 6-month review. So we expect to look forward to an approval sometime in called the June time frame of 2020.
And how big a need do complicated urinary tract infections represent?
Yeah, complicated urinary tract infections are increasingly difficult to treat because of multi-drug resistant bacteria. They're common infections. They tend to be more difficult to treat in older patients and patients with immunocompromise and patients that have received multiple courses of antibiotics, so resistance is high in this group of patients. IV fosfomycin outside of the United States has been shown to be particularly effective for certain classes of multi-drug resistant bacteria. And while the indication we pursued in the U.S. was complicated urinary tract infections, outside of the U.S., the product's indicated for as many as 9 different indications, including complicated urinary tract infections.
Well, what exactly is it, and how unique is it, and how does it work?
So IV fosfomycin is actually an older antibiotic. It's been on the market outside the United States for more than 4 decades, and it's a unique antibiotic that kills bacteria by interrupting a very early stage of cell wall synthesis. So it makes it very difficult for the bacteria to evolve around the antibiotic. It attaches irreversibly to a protein known as murA, and that causes the cell wall to destabilizes and causes cell death. It has a broad spectrum of activity, kills both gram-positive and gram-negative organisms, but its real claim to fame and why there's been such a resurgence of the use of IV fosfomycin around the world is its activity against multi-resistant gram-negative infections in particular. So it's often used in combination with other antibiotics, but there are certainly bacteria that have been in patients that are only susceptible to IV fosfomycin. So it represents, even though it's been around for 4 decades outside the U.S., the IV form represents a new class of antibiotic in the United States.
There were incentives put into place several years ago to encourage the development of new antibiotics. How effective have those measures been, and do you think new incentives are needed, and if so, what might they be?
Sure. So several years ago, Congress passed an act called the GAIN Act, Generating Antibiotic Incentives Now Act, and that was designed to develop more pipeline antibiotic products. And in fact, both Lefamulin and Xenleta benefited from those efforts and received a designation called Qualified Infectious Disease Product, and along with that came extended exclusivity. And so it was very effective. And there have been I think 10 or 12 antibiotics that have come through the pipeline since that time, and there are more in development. And so, from that perspective, it was really effective. The difficulty came that after those products went all the way through FDA approval, and then launched into the market, the commercial market is widely viewed as a broken marketplace, and it's a disconnect between the way hospitals are reimbursed for antibiotics. And so currently, antibiotics are paid by CMS, the Centers for Medicare Services, and they're paid in a bundled way. So if you are in the hospital for a condition and you have an infection, it's all bundled up into one reimbursement to the hospital, and that creates sometimes a perverse incentive for hospitals to pick the most inexpensive antibiotic over the most appropriate antibiotic. And we feel strongly that a change in the reimbursement scheme is needed so that QIDP antibiotics can be carved out of that payment structure and paid for separately, like many other advanced medicines are paid for, so that physicians can decide, not based on the economics, but based on the clinical condition of the patient, what's the most appropriate antibiotic for that patient at this time. There are other incentives that are being bandied about as well, various market entry rewards, and there are some other unique systems that are being experimented with in Europe and other places to solve this global problem. Because the problem with not having a robust marketplace is less about companies not doing well, but you lose the infrastructure that you need to develop new antibacterials. Those scientists just don't sit around waiting for the phone to ring. If their company that they're working for fails, they go and apply their talents to another therapeutic area. It's very difficult to get them to come back. So there are many who believe that could create a 10 to 20 year hole in our antibiotic development efforts if we don't do something to fix the commercial landscape.
Ted Schroeder, CEO of Nabriva Therapeutics. Ted, thanks for your time today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.